Hi, this will be a demonstration of how to add some more advanced motion to the ball bounce animation in After Effects. From the previous video, we created a simple ball bounce that has squash and stretch. It has a shadow to it. And we talked about how to add keyframe animation with position and scale within After Effects. We even created a couple different compositions, ball graphic composition, the ball bounce composition by itself, and then the main composition where we can drag in multiple clips, or in this occasion multiple iterations of the same ball bounce into the same scene or same composition for more fine-tuned editing and compositing. So this video we're going to come back and add some more bounces to our ball bounce here. So we have one bounce, and we're going to come back and add a couple more bounces so that it looks like it's losing force and reacting more naturally. So we have one bounce and it just kind of stops, which is alright. It has a little more character to the ball, as if it was generating the bounce with some force. But we're going to add 2 or 3 more bounces until it looks like it would not have any more force applied to it to add any more bounces. So for this occasion, we're not going to need the last keyframe right now. So with the ball layer, I'm going to delete the last keyframe because the ball is not going to recoil back to a full spherical ball. It's going to transition into the next bounce. So we're going to delete that one, and I'm also going to go to my shadow layer and delete that last recoil for that one as well. So we're going to come back and start adding some more aspects to the motion here to advance the look of the visuals. We can even add some simple effects like motion blur to it as well. I'm going to start with the ball, then come back and adjust with the shadow later. So what we want to do first is add more bounces vertically with the position. Our first bounce took about 1 second to do, and when we are losing force in motion, it's going to take less time for the secondary bounce and less time for the third bounce than the second bounce. So we had a 1 second, so roughly to 2 seconds and 5 frames would be 1 second. So let's dial that back to, I don't know, maybe a little bit less than 3/4 of a second. So that's going to be the next down position where the ball's back down on the ground. So maybe let's go halfway between that, and let's move the ball up in the air. And it's not going to bounce as high, so it's going to bounce about half as high, something like that. And then I'm going to go to let's see, 15 more frames, and we're going to put it back towards the ground. Right? So if you remember, what we can do is we can take our previous frame, let's see, position, so X and Y, we'll copy that. And then over here on, let's see, frame 25 after the first frame, or first second, hit Control C and Control V. There we go. So I'm going to copy, make sure my frame is over here on this frame. I'm going to go back and copy my previous down position, Control C, and then Control V will paste it on top of this frame. Make sure it'll go right back to the same position. Okay. So there we have our second bounce, and it is about 3/4 of a second. We can go ahead and do the positional change for our third bounce. So let's say that'll be half a second maybe, reducing the time again. So you can also come over here, instead of copy and pasting a keyframe, you can come over here to the left of the stopwatch for position X and Y and click the add or remove keyframe at current time. So make sure my frame is over here. This is where I want the ball to be down on the ground again, and I can click the add keyframe button, and it just copies or duplicates that frame over without me having to do copy and paste. I can go halfway in between and move the ball up, something like that. So the first height was way up here, the second bounce height was right there, and the third bounce needs to be much lower, so something like that. So basically the ball is going to lose height each bounce. Okay. My timing, my squash and stretch is not correct here. Let's add a fourth bounce here, which might just be 10 frames. Let's do that. That should work there. So let's come over here to our position and hit the add remove. adds another keyframe there, and then go halfway in between. And then we'll just move the ball up slightly. There we go. So our position keyframes are created. Now we just need to go and adjust the timing. I might make this move down just a little bit. Each time I'm doing this, I'm holding down Shift to snap vertically so it's not moving horizontally as well. So I think before I adjust the timing, I think I'll go ahead and add the squash and stretch because it just looks so natural staying squashed down the whole time. And to do this, I can start by copying some of these keyframes. So here is my scale, the full ball at the top of the bounce. So I want to make sure I copy just the scale attribute there. Here we go. So just the scale. And hit Control C. And then I'm going to go to the highest part of my second bounce, which is right here, and hit Control V. That just copies the scale. So as you notice, it didn't change the position, it just copied the scale because I just had the scale selected. Control C, and then I'm going to go to the next one and hit Control V there. That's the highest point. And then here's my last point where my ball is should be a perfect ball due to gravity. So that'll really kind of change it so it's now pretty much a full ball. Okay. So now I need to go back through and add my squash and stretch to the bottom areas where the ball's near the ground. So there's where the ball's touching the ground, and one frame after that first bounce is where the ball's going to stretch back out. So we'll stretch it and we'll squash it in this way. Now the difference is here's my first squash or my first stretch pose in my first bounce, and every succession bounce is going to squash and stretch less and less because more forces are applied to the first bounce and they depreciate as we go to the second and third bounce. So this squash and stretch needs to be less than the first bounce. Okay, there we go. So we need to dial it down a little more. There you go, I think that'll work. Other one's still stretched out more. That's pretty good. All right, so we're going to go one frame before the ball's at the top of the arc. Or sorry, it's going to blend up to the top of the arc back to a ball. And then here is our next squash position. So one frame before it touches the ground, we want to replicate that stretching. We'll stretch it out again. And then the next frame is when it touches the ground. So this is the squash position. So we'll squash it down, we'll stretch it out. I don't want this to be as stretched as this one, so it's already larger, because we're losing depreciation of that force. There you go. So I want it to be squashed, but not as squashed as the first bounce. There's the first bounce squash, there's the second. One frame after that, it's stretched back out, but this is the third bounce, so we don't want it to be as crazy as the second bounce. There you go, so there's second bounce, third bounce. We're losing that squash and stretch exaggeration each time. It's going to blend to the next frame where the ball's perfect sphere at the top of the arc. This is the next contact with the ground, so let's go one frame before that. Stretch it out a little bit, scale it in a little bit. Okay. And then we'll move one frame next, and this is going to be the squash position. Squash it down, scale it out. We'll look back here. Yep, so this one is definitely not as squashed as the previous bounce. We'll move one frame next, and then we will stretch it out vertically again. This is going to be really close to a ball shape, but a little bit stretched. There you go. So there's the previous one, there's the next one. There's the top of the ball, and then here's the last position of the bounce. So one frame before that, we're going to stretch this out again. Okay, something like that. Okay, looks pretty good. And then the last one is a squash. So I'm going to squash it back down. This is not going to be too crazy of a squash again, but squash it back down. And then we can reset the ball back to a full ball, like a settle. So to do that, let's go copy the very first frame for scale. So frame 0 is a ball. So let's go back to our last frame and then copy, Control C on frame 0 for scale. and then Control V to paste. And that will not make any movement changes, but change the scale so it pops back to a ball. So let's watch that. First bounce, we have our second, third, and fourth bounce. So the position is changed and the squash and stretch is good, but our timing for the position is not proper. The timing for the first bounce has it's slowing down at the top of the arc. It's not doing that for the second, third, and fourth bounce. So to do that, we're going to go into the graph editor, and we're going to look at the Y position. Previous video, we right-clicked and chose Separate Dimensions. So we're going to look at the Y position. You can see visually why the other bounces are not correct. The first bounce, it's sharp or fast out of the first keyframe. It's very slow as it gets to the highest of the arc. So this part right here slows it down, speeds it up as it gets towards the third keyframe. So basically it means if the curve is more vertical, it's faster motion. If the curve is more horizontal, like right here, it's slower motion, which then looks more like how gravity should take a hold of this ball. So this allows us to edit the animation without having to add more keyframes. So we want to do the same thing with these keyframes in the middle here. So I'm going to select the keyframe at the top of the arc for the second bounce, and we're going to hit this button that says Ease, Ease. And what I also like to do is do Ease, Ease in and Ease, Ease out. Click both of those buttons. So that way you can adjust one side differently than the other. There we go. Pull that one out there. We can also select the corner points and then do like an ease out here, which will give me the tangent to be able to adjust this way. Now I can kind of move this in a little bit more. We'll do this one. Let's do ease, ease in and ease, ease out for this as well. And it'll give me the option to kind of make it a sharp in. So basically I can take all of my keyframes and then change those to ease, ease in and ease, ease out. And then I can go back and exaggerate my angles to make it look like a upside down ball bounce, really. Let's see. I'm going to scale in, zoom in here so I can see my curve here. There we go. That looks pretty good. Let's move this out a little bit. Alright, so our arcs look like this. It's an upside down vertical motion here. So now if I go back and hit play, now I have a much better timed motion. Right. So the same keyframes, the same position in my timeline, but I'm adjusting the way the curves look, which will smooth out and make a more natural gravity-based action of each bounce. There we go. So I can turn off the graph and go back and kind of watch my overall timeline. So what I've created is a ball bounce that has 4 different bounces. It's diminishing the height and the squash and stretch with each bounce. And it's timed naturally to where it looks like the ball is losing force, slowing down at the top of the arc, and it's faster near the bottom of each bounce as it gets closer to the ground. What I haven't done next I need to get through is adjusting the shadow for my other bounces as well. So I'm actually going to keep my layer open for my ball so I can see where my keyframes are for my ball, so I can know to replicate that for my shadow. So I'm actually going to do a lot of copying and pasting here. When my ball needs to be a full sphere, I'm going to copy this frame. So I'm going to select that frame for the scale of my shadow and hit Control C. And that would be the top of the arc. So this is the top of the arc for the second bounce. With that layer and scale copied, I'm going to hit Control V to paste that there. This is the top of the arc for the third bounce. Hit Control V to paste that there. This is the top of the arc for the fourth bounce. Control V to paste that there. And then the very last keyframe is where the ball is stationary, not moving anymore. So let's copy and paste that full ball shape there as well. All right. Now I'm going to go back, and this is a stretch. So let's copy that frame, Control C, and then I'm going to move 2 frames later to where the ball is stretching back out for the next bounce, and Control V. This might be a little bit wider because it's not as scaled or squashed as much. There you go. And I'm going to paste that also right here, which is the next time the ball is stretched out. And then we need to go back to another time where we have a squashed point of view and copy that keyframe. So I'm drag selecting over that keyframe, Control C. And this is the next time the ball's on the ground right here, so we're going to Control V. I need to make adjustments, it's not as squashed out, so we'll scale it down a little bit. Here you go. And maybe the next time the ball's on the ground, we can do that as well, and then we'll come adjust the stretching as well. So there's the next time the ball's on the ground. We'll do that, and we'll scale it in a little bit more again. This is the next time, so we'll Control V to paste, and scale that in as well. And now we just need to make our adjustments for the final stretch poses. So there's our last keyframe for a stretch. And this probably needs to be a little wider. That'll work there. This is the next time, so we're going to Control C and Control V. Yeah, this one's a little wider as well. I'm just copying the keyframe and then making adjustments as I move along. So Control V, and then we'll scale it out a little bit more to match the size of the ball. Control V. So I pasted that keyframe. Each time I'm pasting and then making an adjustment, it automatically saves that adjustment that I'm doing here. Good. So this is the last time. Control V. And then I'm going to change the scale, and it saves that adjustment for me. All right, that's it. So now my shadow matches what my ball is doing. There you go. So if I hit play, click off of everything, and hit play. Now my shadow will match what my ball is doing. So that's how we can add more bounces to make the ball bounce more believable and natural looking, according to gravity and according to forces applied to it. There's a lot of other things we can do. We can exaggerate the motion even more. We exaggerate with squash and stretch. We can also exaggerate the motion. One simple way to do this is just to add motion blur. And motion blur is a visual effect that happens when objects in our real world move faster than our eye can keep up with it. Right? So it happens when we're looking at motion in our real world, and we can replicate that in our digital world with animations to add more realism, more believability to the motion. Right now, if I'm watching this, everything is clear other than my blurry shadow, but the ball itself is completely clear no matter if it's moving slowly or in a fast way. So motion blur is an action that we can turn on, and After Effects looks to see how fast the object is moving and adds more blurry effects to that motion if it's faster. If it's moving slower, it'll add less and less blurrier action or shifting of the frames. So basically what it's doing is kind of blending 2 or 3 frames before and after to give that blur effect due to motion. So we do this by clicking on the motion blur icon in 2 different areas. So in our animation timeline, above the layers section, there is an icon that says enable motion blur. It looks like 3 balls kind of scattered in a diagonal angle. It's just to the left of the graph editor that we've used before. So first off, in our timeline in general, we have to enable motion blur for all layers with motion blur switch set. So this says any layer that we determine we want to add motion blur to, allow motion blur to be created. So first off, we have to enable motion blur of my timeline in general. And then on the layer itself, there's a ball layer. There are different icons we can switch on and off for that layer. There's different effects, but the one we're going to use is the motion blur. So we have to turn on the motion blur for the entire timeline, and then individual layers we want to add motion blur to, we checkbox to turn on motion blur for this layer. One other one is the FX. We added a Gaussian blur effects, and it says this layer has an effects on there. Okay, we abbreviate effects with FX. So for motion blur, now we hit play. The ball is more blurrier the faster it's moving. It is a subtle change, but our eye notices it as seeming believable. So if I stop the ball as it's moving up, kind of right here, there's a good spot. I'm not blurring with a Gaussian blur on the ball, because I don't want every frame to be blurry. If I go back to, let's see, down here on frame 0, the ball is a perfect sphere. It's not blurry. It's in clear and focus. But if I go a couple frames as the ball's moving up, it's blurry because it's moving faster. As it gets top of the arc, it's slowing its motion, so it's less blurry there. As it gets back down, moving faster, it's going to blur more. So it is a subtle effect, but if I play this, we feel that effect. We feel that motion blur. And we treat it as believable because we see that same kind of action in our real world. There's a bunch of other things we can add effects-wise to kind of spice up the animation, add more exaggeration to this, but there's some other things we can do to add more believability and more engaging and visual aspects to this ball bounce. Alright, that'll wrap up this video, adding some more bounces to our single bounce that we had previously, and then adding some motion blur.